Afternoon, everyone. How's everyone this side of the room? Okay, how many engineers do we have in the room? I feared only engineers at the end. Okay, so I am not surprised that this crowd is baffled by human factors and process safety culture assessments. What's the old joke, right? What's the difference between an introvert engineer and an extrovert engineer? And the answer is, an extrovert engineer stares at your shoes while they're talking to you. Okay, so now you got a flavor of where we're going. I must be Paul Penn because it's on the screen, and they say when they hired me at CalEPA, before that my boss, the assistant secretary, went in for 2 positions, and he ended up hiring somebody with a long title. So I have both the refinery safety program and the emergency management program at CalEPA. Somewhat like Kay was talking about, I consider my emergency management title as my general duty clause, allowing me to stick my nose in all sorts of places it doesn't belong. So before I jump into the emergency preparedness and response stuff, I took some notes today. So we've really, at the Interagency Refinery Task Force, we focused in on the safety and prevention side, because that's where you get the most benefit. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the downside of that. It's really the upside and downside. And where do we see the problems often are startup, shutdown, and mishaps. And so those of you who know, anyone live in Torrance area, was living with bated breath the past week on the startup. It's interesting stuff. Oh, were you talking about minutes between tasks? Who is that? Right. That's MBT. See, that means something different to me. As a trainer, MBT stands for maximum butt time. And I think we've just about hit that, right? Yeah, it is the same thing, right? I would be remiss if I didn't plug the Continuing Challenge, largest hazmat emergency response conference in the country, Labor Day week, Sacramento, hazmat.org. How's that for $1 million address? Colonial Institute, Ammonia Safety Training Institute, Chemical Safety Board. We're going to have Thursday night at the movies. So you saw the video that Steve showed earlier on the Millard facility. Well, I'm calling it No Good, Just the Bad and the Ugly. Okay? And they're going to be showing some of their top videos with actually the chair of the CSB out. So it should be pretty cool. We've got Transcare, they're bringing out the train. Good stuff. Yeah, the RMP. So, by the way, the comments, I don't think it's been mentioned yet, but the comments are due tomorrow on the RMP? Yeah, I know that. So I've already reviewed the CSB's comments. They're interesting. CalEPA's comments, Dr. Solomon did a really outstanding job. NASTIPO, the National Association of Sarah Title III Program Officials that Kay alluded to, and Randy with Contra Costa and the Coupa Forum are also submitting comments. And a lot of them are the same, similar from the regulator side. So it'll be interesting to see what it came out. So those of you that live in Southern California, part of the RAND Corporation assessment of the impacts of the proposed safety and prevention regs indicated that the cost to you and me, somewhat living in Northern California, for gasoline has been $2.4 billion in increased prices because of the explosion at the ExxonMobil facility. That's what you and I pay, right? That same report talks about that the increase at the pump for the safety and prevention implementation of the PSM and the CalARP program is around, I believe, 0.004 cents per gallon. I would rather pay that 0.004 cents per gallon than paying the $2.4 billion, and that report came out a couple months ago, of what we've had to pay additionally at the pump because of the lack of capacity at the ExxonMobil facility. Interesting, thought process. What else? What other notes did I take? One of the focuses of the work we've been doing has been on the safety and prevention is taking these fine upstanding members of the community, CalARP, and these fine upstanding members of the community, the CalARP side, and strengthening and aligning the programs. So strengthening meaning we've learned from stuff. Why do we put in the damage mechanism review? Because of the sulfidation of the Chevron Richmond facility, right? But industry is going, oh, you're making us crazy. You're regulating us to death, right? How many times do you hear that, right? They're not right, semi-right. But the point is, they have taken, I can't tell you how much effort to align these standards so that our feeling is we don't want the regulated community to spend their entire time working on administrivia. We want them to put their effort into the substance of the regulations. So the alignment, to me, is a great selling point. You do this once, you meet the PSM and the RMP CalARP requirements. And I think that's a big issue. A recurring theme here. Before I started my job, I just returned to state service 2 years ago. I was a consultant also. But they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Or I had a lapse in judgment. I haven't quite figured out which one, right? But my boss, the assistant secretary, said, so if we were going to, beyond the petroleum stuff, if we were going to focus in on chemicals of concern, what would you say? And I immediately responded, ammonia, chlorine, and HF. And I see that, somewhat those chemicals keep coming up, and for good reason. Okay? I do have one rule in my presentation. This is very important. Okay? Heckling is permitted and encouraged. Are we good? Okay, so let's jump in here. Okay. When I did a similar presentation for Kern County in RMP last October, I think it was, or so, I just come back from the 32-hour presentation at the Ammonia Safety Training Institute, which is really cool because on the last day, they released ammonia out at Fort Ord, and they got up to 35,000 parts per million. It was pretty exciting. And they had an injury, and it was a real cocky guy from Chicago Fire. Oh, I'm from Chicago Fire. Oh. And he kneeled down into liquid ammonia, and it snuck up his turnout leg, and the guy started dancing. We had a drone overhead. So they're doing the release, and all of a sudden they see this guy running, and the drone goes, oh, as the guy is peeling out his gear, right? But enough water?
You got the best shower treatment anybody ever got.
That's right. And then he was doing internal hydration later that night to help him feel better. Okay, so their motto was prevent them all or keep them small. So I just want to talk about this. We want to prevent them all. We want to reduce the frequency. But it's important to understand that that's a legacy. My friends, on the hazmat teams, 20 years ago, they were going on hazmat calls all the time. Now they're sitting around the station going, oh, what do we do now? Right? My friends on a hazmat team, they got a call last year, I remember, and it was latex paint in like a ditch in cans, and they would just spend the whole day haz-canning it just because they needed the practice. So that's a testament to the work we all do because we have less frequency of events. That's good stuff, right? That's really why we're here. But it has some problems, okay? Because, if you don't have a lot of bad stuff, what we're saying is this is going back to those hierarchy of hazard control stuff. Oh, by the way, there's no math in this presentation. But you're all engineers. I thought that's like mother's milk to you guys, right? Okay. And then we want to figure out how to minimize that release if it does occur. That's the stuff we do in here, right? It's good stuff. Right? And make sure your containment scheme doesn't have unintended consequences. Like, well, when you vent things out to where people are walking by. So these programs work. It takes years. It takes years to make it happen, but it has happened. But it does require multi-level, multi-display, and multimedia stuff. And one of the things I've loved in this job is this organization is a wonderful organization. They did not play well in the sandbox because they were a solo organization. They were like saying, we're CalOSHA and we just deal with CalOSHA. But the Refinery Task Force is really one of the first times it's required them to really work with other organizations. That's a great thing. We have learned so much from Contra Costa County. So when organizations say, we can't comply with that, that'll drive us out of business. Well, it's been in place for 15 years. So we've got most of that, and we keep learning more, right? And then the opportunity to work with these fine, upstanding members of the community. And working with Kay, it's really been a great opportunity to really, tap into the expertise and the experiences of us all. But the problem is, how do you justify your organization? Right? How do you justify the work if you have less events? Right? And I've seen a lot of hazmat teams either folding or going from dedicated hazmat teams to being, other duties is assigned. So that has the impact. And just the skill sets. You don't have that many events. How do you maintain those skill sets? The answer is training and exercising. Oh, we spent a little too much time training, and this stuff ain't cheap. So, those are just some prelude thoughts. Refinery Task Force, as kind of Chone indicated, and I'll reinforce. I have to thank Chevron Richmond for blowing up in 2012. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a job today. So, because that's what came out of this. Interagency Refinery Task Force. Actually, the governor appointed a working group. And then they issued a report. And Johnny, that's the last you ever hear of it, right? But I have to say they've really put an amazing amount of effort into this. Because bad things happen. So the emphasis of the working group report were these topics. My universe, emergency preparedness and response, safety and prevention, public education, enforcement coordination, and the task force itself. So most of the stuff I've been talking about today is the safety and prevention side. And I have got to say that the work has gone in with Top Cat. I am going to keep that. He is Top Cat in my mind forever. Right? With CalOSHA and the folks in my shop. And we've had the involvement of 2 people at the deputy secretary level for the entire time. And that says a lot because they've got a lot of things on their plate. So we talked about the safety and prevention side. I'm not going to bore you with this. I'm going to focus in on the emergency preparedness and response. So the report from the governor's office basically said, jump on this stuff, because we learned that radio communications and other communication methods were a problem. Okay? Now, I can tell you after every event and every exercise during the debrief, someone is going to raise their hand and going to stand up and they're going to stick out their chest and they're going to go, well, communication and coordination was a problem. And they will be right. You will never eliminate that issue, but you can do a lot to minimize it. And that's really what we're trying to focus in on here, including the actual physical ability of people to communicate. I don't want the responding organizations to be making their first contact with the point of origin at the gate. Okay? They need to be communicating before, and between the multiple disciplines, they need to be able to communicate effectively on both tactical levels and then other management levels. The true use of incident command. One thing that we learned, for example, with Torrance Fire and ExxonMobil, is they do have a really good unified command program. They've worked on this for years. Something happens, they get together. The problem is, in a number of cases, that we learned was, one, they focus in on the point of origin. They focus in on the leak, the fire, and the minor injuries at that site. They didn't do a very good job of addressing the off-site consequences of the spent catalyst going up and over and into the community. Because they focus in on the point of origin. Understandable. Not good. Understandable. There are ways to deal with that. And what they did not do well is integrating non-traditional organizations that have emergency response responsibilities. Specifically, CalOSHA and the AQMD. Great resources. They have authorities there, but they're just not fire law and EMS. So we have to really much more effectively bring them into the circumstance, into the organization, into that necessarily the unified command, but the overall management of the event, right? So if you've got monitoring devices of the fire department and monitoring devices with ExxonMobil, and the AQMD shows up, and LA County Fire Health Hazmat show up, well, now we've got all sorts of resources. Why don't we make sure we deploy them appropriately and get and be able to use the data? Okay, so that's that. Plans and protocols to protect persons outside the refinery. Boy, that's like letting me loose in a candy shop, right? Because how do you protect people from outside the refinery? And that opens up a whole new universe, which I'll talk about in a moment. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Thankfully, these are, as I talked about earlier, these are low frequency but high consequence events. So unless you drill and exercise, you're not going to be able to perform well because you don't do this on a regular basis. I came back into the oil business. I used to do oil spill response years ago. But I've been in healthcare emergency management for 15 years. You don't need to teach a phlebotomist how to suck blood because they do it 25, 35, 50 times a day. But if you don't do this stuff on a regular basis, you're going to miss the vein. Okay? And this issue of preparation for airborne releases. So, originally the governor's report said, well, you have to update the area plans. The area plans are what the Koopas develop to talk about hazardous materials response within their community. So we worked on it originally, and the Koopa said, we can't do what you want us to do unless the refineries themselves take certain actions. And I went, oh, great. I hate writing regulations, and now I have to write 2 sets of regulations. So we broke it into the CalARP section on section 7, I believe, on the emergency response program, and then basically the attendant area plan component. As we developed these regs, this is kind of unusual, I made the regulations shorter. So now the CalARP regs are 3 pages, unlike the safety and prevention regs, which are pretty hefty. Okay? Now, these are performance, and we truly wanted to make them performance, and we wanted to make the refineries work specifically with the Koopas, and I want them to be the final arbiters of good taste. Get a little pushback on that, but we'll work it through. First thing is, originally we're going to go, well, how about this? We'll do the worst case scenario. I don't like that. Twice the toxic endpoints, that's got potential. And finally we said, how about we require the refineries to establish a geographic zone of places that would be impacted beyond their facility. Now there's lots of different ways, but we wanted to really work on this. And I want to go beyond, let's say, whatever the flammability, the toxicity, the explosion, whatever it is. I want to deal with the overall community, because if you've got a major event, if you've got evacuations, it's going to go beyond there. We're going to have to work on traffic patterns. We're going to have to deal with a lot of other issues, right? So, we're going to establish this geographic zone. This is going to be an interesting process. We want people to do both outreach, notification, and monitoring. Okay? We want to do outreach. We want to tell people what are the hazards that are out there, right? We want to say, how will you be notified, right? Do we send them the bat signal? Right? So, and we believe in multiple approaches to notification. What actions they should take. And we say, you basically have 2 choices, right? Evacuation and sheltering in place. Or in the basic lexicon is you either hunker down or run like hell. Those are your 2 choices, right? How do you get more information? So, for example, when they fired up the ExxonMobil facility, there was a glitch in one of the monitors, and it was showing like 65 parts per million, I forget what it was, of the PM 2.5, which is like completely, you're not going to get 65,000. But the community was going, what's going on here, right? So we need to ensure that people have access to good, reliable information, okay? And then we want to communicate with certain institutions, okay? basically we're looking at where people congregate and whatever the expression you want to use these days, special populations, access and functional needs, people who cannot engage, as the NFPA refers to as, cannot engage in self-preservation. So we look at medical facilities. Now they're a special crowd, but schools, transit agencies, railroads, utilities, businesses with workers, and sites where people congregate. Right? So the Richmond Mall, down from the Chevron Richmond facility. The thing is, communicating with people that live and work in a community is one thing, but communicating with people who are transient, and I'm not talking about people who are homeless, but people who do not have roots in that community, is much more difficult. Right? So how do you deal with that? Medical facilities, again, I was in healthcare emergency management. I developed a program called Hazmat for Healthcare. Yes, Michael?
Here in South Dakota, there's a thunderstorm. There are speakers all over the place warning you to church.
So it depends on your proclivities. It depends on where you're getting your inspiration. You go to church? But yeah, the warning systems. Again, now a lot of this stuff I base on other stuff because I'm lazy. Again, the geographic zone, I'm looking at the emergency planning zones from nuclear power plants. Right? And again, ways to communicate with the public. Here's a good example. There are a lot of good examples out there that we want to pinch from. Okay? So what are you doing in South Dakota in June?
I have relatives there.
That's Bohemian?
Yes.
I was listening.
I gotta tell you, we went to the movie theater. You know what was playing?
Let me see. It had been some sort of like Twister. There, perfect. You know, as they should be, right? You know, I spend a lot of time traveling around the country doing training, and people go, "Oh, I couldn't live in California. Those earthquakes scare me." Earthquakes don't scare me. Tornadoes scare the hell out of me. And I have been like places in Texas, and there's, I'm sitting in my hotel room, and I'm just watching things pop up on the TV. I'm going, uh-oh. Or I'm teaching in Anniston, Alabama, and we got 200 people in the basement in Anniston, Alabama, with no air conditioning in the middle of the summer. What fun. Tornadoes, they scare the hell out of me. Okay, so, medical facilities. In the mind's eye of the public, a hospital is where people go for safety and care. Right? And what happens is people will go there, even if they're not hurt. They'll go there because they're scared. Now, in the case of Richmond, because of the Gen Chem incident, some folks realize that they get money. Right? So if there's any major event in some communities, they're going to show up in droves. But that interferes with the ability of the hospital to provide medical care to the people who need medical care. Do those people need care? The answer is yes. Right? The other folks, they just don't need medical care. They might need mental health care, and they might need others. And I'm serious. So how do you bifurcate that crowd coming into the facility? Right? But that means the outreach has got to be done to those local facilities. Plus, if you had 5 minutes heads up, you could protect your manners of ingress so that you don't have the possibility, or minimize the possibility of compromising your facility by contaminated people coming into your hospital. Okay? We want to talk about notification. We want to recognize that in many cases, let me see, who are the folks that live around refineries? That'll be poor people. Poor people tend to be new immigrants. New immigrants tend to speak multiple languages, right? So if you just do outreach and notification in English, you're going to miss a large part of your population. So it's incumbent upon the folks here, in this case the refineries, to ensure that we make a good effort to communicate. Now, do we have to communicate in all 65 languages? No. But we can communicate in the predominant languages surrounding that community. For example, in Richmond is a very sizable Lao population, correct? Right? So it would be appropriate to be able to communicate in Lao. Okay? Different technologies, right? How many people are disconnected from home telephone, right? How do we use the different systems? In Contra Costa County, they really didn't go into much, but they've got a phenomenal community warning system. I mean, it adds a bat signal to the sirens, the reverse 911, the weather system, all the rest of those things. That is really amazing. Okay, they still had problems during Exxon, during the Chevron Richmond facility, and some subsequent events. Will it be perfect? No. But if we use multiple approaches, multiple languages, multiple technologies, we're going to be much better off. And again, dealing with the folks with access and functional needs. These are society's most vulnerable members, and we need to have the opportunity to take care of the folks who need our help the most, right? If I have a car and I'm mobile and I got a credit card, my needs are probably less than someone who doesn't have a car, is not mobile, and doesn't have a credit card. Okay? Then talking about communicating with the emergency response organizations, the community itself, the institutions within there, right? We need to ensure testing and maintenance. If we don't have good preventative maintenance, we push the button and nothing happens, right? And then the issue of coordinating and conducting protective actions. Now, I want to say right now that a number of the refineries and some of the Coopers saying, wait a second, that's not the refinery's responsibility. That's the Cooper's responsibility. And I'd say, well, you know what? In many cases, it will be a public agency that will carry this out. But I want to place the onus on the refineries themselves to ensure that it gets done. I don't really care how it gets done, but I want to make sure it gets done. Although this was a compelling argument, actually from the folks in El Segundo, saying this should be in the public sector, coordinating and conducting protective actions. And I basically said, yes, I should pull this off, and it's actually should be in the area plans, as not as the public sector should be the ones to say either hunker down or run like hell. Okay. And then again, the use of the incident command system, and including the California's standardized emergency management system, the NIMS refresh. See, we had to make comments on all sorts of things this past week because they're updating the NIMS system, and their comments were due earlier this week. An interesting addition that's coming up in the National Incident Management System, we believe, is the inclusion of a science and technology officer as an advisor to the incident commander, which I think is outstanding, because how often do incident commanders make decisions not based on good empirical evidence? So we see that as a really strong improvement in the system. We also want to make sure that people have sufficient resources. If you say this may happen, well, what are you going to do to deal with what may happen? Because too often people say, well, we're going to do this and this, but they really don't have the capability. So it's really to demonstrate competency. Okay? And how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. We want to make sure that folks are trained in the right things. So ICS side, and I put in the standards, applicable worker safety standards. And I had a trade organization, which remain unnamed, said, well, how do we know which applicable worker safety standards they're talking? Well, Michael had a slide earlier that had all of them on there. Respiratory protection standard, has Whopper. I'm going, it doesn't take a brainiac to do that. In fact, this is my feedback spot. I mean, I don't really care about your Form 300. And I don't really care about it when it comes to emergency response. I want to make sure that people are competent in the things that they need to do to respond safely and effectively. And then we want to ensure that people are doing drills and exercises. The proposed RMP calls for a full-scale exercise every 5 years. I personally think if you're not doing a full-scale exercise as a refinery every year, you're not doing yourself or everyone else a service, but we compromise to 3 years. My expectation is that you will have a series, a master schedule that will be doing tabletops, functionals, full scales, go back, learn, change, and come back and do this on a regular basis. Okay? Now, the question keeps coming up is, well, this is only refineries. Why should I be paying attention? Well, Let's be honest. All we need is one major event at Dow or DuPont or any one of the other chemical facilities, and a legislator is saying, hey, that stuff you had applied to refineries, well, you need to apply to other folks. I could see that happening down the road, and we did not write that for that, but we were mindful of that as we developed these programs. Okay, we wanted to make these realistic and reasonable and appropriate. And if anyone thinks that it's not that, please let me know. Okay, because we're really striving to say what is reasonable and appropriate, and we want to ensure that they work well with the Koopa. I want the Koopas to be the final arbiters of good taste, not some knucklehead like me up in Sacramento. Okay? And one of the points is a lot of the work that we're going to require them to do, they're already doing. So you don't need to go through a bunch of rigmarole if you're saying, here's a section you got to comply with. You go, see Appendix D. And you put whatever you had that meets that, all or part of that requirement into Appendix D. To me, I'm happy. Okay? Before I go on to the area plans, any questions, comments, or thoughts? Yes, sir. How is Torrance when it's fired up? Are you okay?
I found out about the telephone via the telephone because I was doing a different job. And my kids go to North Pop, right down the street.
Right.
So the explosion goes off. My boss calls me and says, "Hey, you better check on the kids." And my kids give me a text. Yeah, we're fine. We're hunkered in place. And I waited about 45 minutes to an hour, and I said, "Okay, I'll come get you." The emergency response was lax, so it took me 2.5 hours. They had no when the particles went in the air, teachers panicked, students panicked, so you didn't come here with me being in the profession. That's not my question.
I was waiting for that part. Good lead in though.
How do you develop this zone finally, or how would the public know what the zone is?
Oh, well, that's the point is that when the intent here is that when they develop the zone, the outreach will say, you're in the zone, right? And make that a requirement. And so, I mean, that's the short answer, is that when we establish a zone, part of that requirement is to do outreach to the community saying, you are potentially impacted by this. And it may not just be the impact of the chemical or the toxic or the explosion or the flammable, but you may be impacted because of the spillover, maybe sometimes of people or things like that in the community. So that's really the intent. And one of the reasons we said specifically with schools is because just of what you said. Okay? That answer your question? Oh, Michael.
What he's talking about brings up a big problem when there's an emergency like this, which is traffic control, crowd control, things like that. I was in the earthquake in 1989 in San Francisco.
Lower period to October 17th, but who's counting?
Yeah. And that was before cell phones. And you'd have to wait in line. Or, if you had access to a phone, you'd have to wait to get through. You couldn't even get through.
Mm-hmm.
The existing systems get jammed up.
We be jamming now, man. Oh, and you see that all the time. And as people move away from landline phones, for example, it exacerbates the problem because, as they say, cell phones are designed to cover 80% of the calls 80% of the time. They will not experience that. Right? Some people are better or worse. Other questions, comments, or thoughts? Okay, so we built up from there. We went, okay, now we have something to play with on the area plans. So what you have listed behind you are basically this from the community's perspective, with the Koopa being able to augment their area plan for those jurisdictions, that have refineries within them, to address this, because we want to talk about overall mutual aid. And the example I use is going back a ways. Back in the late 80s, I think, the Pope went to Laguna Seca in Monterey. Big deal, right? And so the Pope was going to Laguna Seca. So all, it's a racetrack. So all of the EMS organizations figured out how many ambulances were available to respond. And they said, okay, there are 8 ambulances we can get. At the same time, the diocese reached out and said, how many ambulances are there? And they found out that there were 8 ambulances available. And so on their resource list, how many ambulances did they have? And how many do they really have? 8, maybe. And I can tell you that day was a hot day and people were in high level of emotional states and they needed 16 ambulances. Okay? So we need to make sure that we're not double dipping, we're not double counting, and that we actually have, sufficient equipment. Now, here in California, we have that added dramatic component, which is seismicity. Right? I'm not necessarily going to ask every refinery in the Midwest, if I was running the show, to be able to double up, right? Because a tornado would probably only hit one, unless it was next to a trailer park. Now that's another bad joke. Okay, so the point is that here, because we have seismicity, and just so happens almost all the refineries, except for the ones probably in Kern County, are in highly seismic areas. So do we go back to the DoD's old approach to, in the Cold Wars, being able to fight 2 wars on 2 different continents simultaneously? I'm not quite sure. But the point is we need to have sufficient resources. Okay? So basically covers all the rest of this stuff, but looks at it from a broader perspective. The other thing that I threw in here that I don't think I mentioned is that the onus on the jurisdiction where the refinery resides to communicate with the jurisdictions contiguous with it, because I know you're shocked to realize that chemical emergencies do not respect political boundaries. So we don't want something just happening in Torrance and they're not talking to the people next to them. So that's the approach. Just a quick thing, enforcement coordination, I think was mentioned, that we've done a lot of joint training thanks to EPA for funding, OSHA for, CalOSHA for sponsoring, and the CUPAs and the other regulatory agencies for attending very high level training that's been going on, and it was mentioned earlier. It's really great so that when Farba and Kay and Tone are sitting in the same room taking training, that's where you build the relationships. Okay? We've also done joint inspections. We had one where we had 7 agencies going in and doing a joint inspection, which meant that, first of all, we could rely on each other's expertise. We could work with people going, okay, Little John, you take the point, Cage, you take the BAR, so we can spend our time most effectively there. And the refinery themselves said how much they appreciated this, because they only had to they only had to provide documentation at one time instead of someone coming in and then the next week coming in and the next week coming in and asking for the same stuff. So it made that process less onerous. Is that a good way to put it? And community outreach. We do safety forums. It depends on the topics. A lot of them were over the regs recently. We've done tons of stuff. I'm looking forward to do some stuff on what data is out there for the communities and how can they use it. SIRS was mentioned a number of times. We've got a new thing called EnviroView, EnviroScreen. So we got all sorts of top stuff. So this stuff really does work. Okay? Eventually this may extend to elsewhere. We've done a lot of work and I think it's paid off. But lacking emergencies impacts the ability of developing and maintaining a robust emergency response capability. Oh, bad things happen. Always remember that. Because you take people and bad stuff, eventually bad stuff happens. So what are we doing? We're doing the things, hopefully, to reduce the frequency and magnitude of these events. That's me. That's it. Questions, comments, thoughts? Come on. I didn't say that. I said Torrance Fire and ExxonMobil have a very strong ability to develop a unified command.
Well, there isn't enough foam extinguishing agent in any one refinery to handle an actual big fire.
Right, and so that's
Without the assistance of the other refineries, their fire departments, they can't cover it. So they do have this really nice cooperative arrangement set up, which I thought that was what
right.
you talked about.
Well, and so I didn't, but one of the reasons some folks didn't come here today is because among the other aid meetings today was the Southern California Industrial Mutual Aid Organization, SCIMO, here in Southern California was meeting, and then up in Contra Costa they've got within the CARE organization they've got a mutual aid component. Yeah, they all got to realize that we're all in this together. And that is a great example, and and we want to encourage all of that. So we brought down the executive director of the Contra Costa Care Organization to Kern County to encourage them to develop a care organization of their own. So, any other thoughts, comments? You guys most want to get out of here. So, Steve, I will turn it back over to you.